Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's going to be a little noisy here, but hopefully you can hear us. This is an event of the Center on Communication, Leadership and Policy, and they have put this together. We have here two members of Congress. At the end of the table, we have Congresswoman Bass, who is most importantly the Trojan Congresswoman, representing us here. This is her fourth term in Congress. She represents the 37th District. She serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee and is the ranking member on the Africa Subcommittee. She is also on the Judiciary Committee working on issues around IP and intellectual property and criminal justice reform. Before being elected to Congress, she was the first African-American woman Speaker of the California Assembly. And on my right is Congressman Adam Schiff, who represents California's 28th District in Pasadena and Burbank and the like. This is his 9th term in Congress, and many of you might know him from his stint on cable news. He is the ranking member on the House Select Committee on Intelligence. He is also the author of the Daniel Pearl Freedom of the Press Act, which requires the State Department to include press freedoms in its annual human rights report. And before being elected to Congress, he was in the California Senate, and before that, he was a federal prosecutor. So we are here today to speak with these two members of Congress and ask some fundamental questions about our democracy, our institutions, the role of the media, and civic responsibility. And the reason that we have to ask those questions today is because so many of the norms of political life, of public life, have been dramatically changed in the past year. And many have been simply outright discarded. I'll mention a few, but we have a president who parted with tradition and did not release his tax returns as a candidate. We also have a president who communicates very frequently on Twitter, sometimes in very blunt manners, as happened this morning, in very delicate situations. We also have a tremendous polarization, not just in the White House, but also in the houses of Congress, where we saw a Supreme Court justice elected with a majority vote. And we also see institutions such as the Office of Government Ethics being effectively sort of cut loose. So all of these changes have been quite dramatic. Some have come abruptly, some have sort of crept up on us. And though, if I can just get a slide here, though the politicians not telling the truth might not be exactly a newsworthy event, apologies to the members of the panel here, we've really sort of broken new ground in the way in which blatant untruths are communicated to the public. And I have up here basically the slide of the first full day of this administration when we saw the White House press secretary try to get the public to believe something that was demonstrably false about crowd sizes. And though that is a breaking of a norm, what we also saw on Sunday was that same person making an appearance at the Emmys, where essentially the media has kind of normalized that behavior in some way. And that's troubling. At the same time, we also see that trust in our traditional news sources has plummeted dramatically. There's a little bit of a partisan divide on that, but it's plummeted on both the right and the left. And we also see how our information ecosystems have become polluted. Here you see a tweet from, sort of a prominent Democratic operative disparaging a photo that he thinks is Sarah Huckabee Sanders, but we see that it's actually an actress from Freaks and Geeks, and he too fell for fake news. So this is something that impacts all of us, and sometimes irrespective of party. So my first question to our panelists here is, these norms that we took for granted, how essential are they to actual governing? And can we continue the process of governing even as these norms have been disrupted?
Well, Professor, first of all, thank you for inviting us to join you today. It's wonderful to be back on the campus I last had an opportunity to participate in a panel with General Petraeus here, which seems like a few months ago, but was probably at least a year ago. And it's wonderful to be back on your home turf, Karen. I think one of the things that we've discovered, much to our shock, is just how much damage can be done even operating within the letter of the law, if that's what's happening, in my view, if you have the wrong person in the Oval Office. The violation of certain norms of behavior that we didn't think we needed to codify into statute because it was not very easy to contemplate people simply ignoring them or trampling them. And Gabriel, you mentioned, for example, disclosure of tax returns. I think up until this presidential cycle, we all felt that that had become such a well-entrenched practice that no one could really avoid doing it. And here we had a candidate who not only avoided doing it and then made the claim that he would release his tax returns after his audit was done. Of course, we don't even know whether an audit exists. And then later would acknowledge, well, I won, so it doesn't matter, nobody really cares, and I'm not going to do it anyway. We will now have to legislate that norm, that if you're going to run for president, you need to disclose your taxes. There are other things that I think are already prohibited, but we may need to make it all the more abundant in statute. Other norms of office, the norm that you don't profit from your office, that you don't effectively force the government to patronize your businesses. Our president spends just about every weekend at one of his properties and forces the government to patronize his businesses. Just this year alone, the Secret Service has spent $60,000 renting Trump golf carts to protect the president. I don't begrudge the right of the president to go on vacation, but I do begrudge him charging taxpayers or enriching himself in office. Now, that was a norm of behavior. It may be, I think, more than a norm. It may already be prohibited by the Emoluments Clause when it comes to foreign entities or domestic emoluments, but we are now going to have to set that out by letter of law. There are still other things, though, that we are powerless to legislate, and we are powerless to legislate having respect for the media, not having disdain for the media. It is quite shocking to me that we have a president who has referred to the press as the enemy of the people. And that is not something we can legislate. That is something ultimately we have to count on the voters to choose candidates carefully and wisely, and those that have respect for our system of checks and balances and the role of a free media in our society. So there are certain things I think we're going to have to now re-examine, and in light of the fact that we cannot count on an occupant of that office necessarily maintaining norms that others in office have maintained as long as we can remember.
Well, thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. It's pretty amazing to come in here. I've never been in here before, and to see the Annenberg School is very amazing. But let me just say that I'm honored to be here with my very distinguished colleague. And you know, when you hear about us in Congress, you think that, number one, we don't do anything. That's one thing. And you think that we all hate each other and fight and all. And I will tell you that one of the things that is the most rewarding about being in Congress is being able to serve with colleagues like Adam Schiff. Because I think all of us around the country have been just extremely proud of how he has handled such complex issues and how he's allowed all of us to kind of understand, even though it's difficult because he serves on Intel and he can't tell us the real secrets, but he does really good.
We're going to make him talk today.
At helping us understand what is going on. So I just want to say that that's something that I hope you appreciate, that we all really enjoy about being in Congress. But, you know, to your question about breaking norms, we got to go back a little bit, because I think the norms were broken, first of all, as soon as this guy entered the campaign. Because the way the media essentially gave him carte blanche, I mean, whenever did you see somebody be interviewed over the telephone? And that was a norm that you'd have to go in the studio. You can't call up a TV station. And I watched him on MSNBC speak for a half hour on the phone on Morning Joe, and then hang up and call CNN and talk for another half hour. And then the media was amazed at how did this guy arrive at how he did when they gave him billions of dollars of free airtime. And I think that we need to examine that, and I think it's a part of our celebrity culture. And, you know, we have elected celebrities before. I served with one when I was in Sacramento. But even if you think back before the campaign and think about birtherism, how was that even allowed to take off? How was he allowed to reach such proportions that he could push a sitting president to have to show his birth certificate and then demand his transcripts because he didn't believe that he had actually graduated or entered into a Harvard Law School legitimately. So I think the breaking of the norms has happened in a lot of different ways, but I do think, and I know there's going to be lots of studies looking back at this campaign, but we really have to look at that because that had never happened before.
So as we sort of try to react to this unprecedented norm breaking, can you guys tell me, are the institutions of government strong enough to resist this? You talked, Congressman Schiff, about actually legislating things that had been normative behavior previously, but how much can institutions resist in a period of unprecedented norm breaking?
Well, it's a good question. I've been quoting Jim Clapper, who until recently was the Director of National Intelligence. Quite often, this is someone who served the country for 50 years, ever since Vietnam, doesn't have a partisan bone in his body, and who said recently that he thought what we were going through was worse than Watergate. Yeah. And I've been quoting him as saying that because during Watergate, yes, we had a dysfunctional presidency, but we had a functional Congress. We now have a dysfunctional presidency on top of a dysfunctional Congress, and it is really shaking the republic to its foundation. And I had lunch with Jim Clapper recently, and I said, I've been quoting you a lot. That was my interpretation of what you said. I don't know whether I had it right. And he said, well, I agree with you, but that's not at all what I meant. What I meant was the fact that Watergate was a third-rate burglary, right, followed up by a cover-up. This was an attack by a nation-state, a violation of our sovereignty, and a highly consequential one during a presidential election. And then, of course, we have all what you could describe as cover-up. But I do think fundamentally what is posing the biggest threat to us right now is we don't have a Congress that is doing the kind of oversight that we really should be, that is effectively checking the president as we should. And I say, thank God for the courts, that Article 3 is functioning well, and because they can be a check on unconstitutional overreach by the administration, whether it's with their executive order to ban Muslims from certain countries or other unconstitutional steps. And thank goodness for the media in its ability to shed a spotlight on what the administration is doing and hold the administration accountable. So I don't think we are demonstrating that we're up to the job at the moment. I spoke with John McCain a few weeks ago, just before he became ill, and I was marveling to him that there's not a single Republican in the House that feels they have a constituency to be the John McCain of the House, to speak out, to call out when they believe that the President of the United States has stepped over the line. And we have to hope that that changes. We can't, I think, continue to rely solely on the courts as a backstop. But I would have to say, Gabriel, that at this point, I'm not particularly optimistic. There are a lot of things the Government Reform Committee, for example, should be investigating. Now, this is a Government Reform Committee that investigated at the drop of a hat during the Obama administration. I was dragooned into 2 years of service on the Benghazi Committee, which was a committee set up for a political purpose, and they spent 2 years and $7 million, and that followed 8 other nonpartisan investigations. But now, we can't seem to get a Government Reform Committee motivated to look at anything the Trump administration is doing. And so our oversight function is not performing the way it should. On the Russia stuff, we are doing our investigation, and the Senate is as well, and that's positive. It's also very difficult. But in terms of the norms that you're talking about, they're usually held in check by a Congress that is using its subpoena power to bring in witnesses. And just to give one example, again, the emoluments problem cries out. There are daily violations of our Constitution, It cries out for oversight. I'll give one illustration. You might remember when the president was at Mar-a-Lago, well, that doesn't narrow it down, when he was there with the Japanese prime minister and the North Koreans were shooting off missiles, and there were all these photographs of the president reviewing documents by cell phone camera light, and people were asking whether those documents were classified because those phones were not. And I read those articles, and even though I live in an intelligence world all the time, what leapt out to me when I read those articles was, wait a minute, dues at Mar-a-Lago have gone up 100% from last year? What is that all about? Clearly, the president is using his access to make money. And Congress ought to be investigating that. Congress ought to be prohibiting that. But instead, the responsible committees are sitting on their hands. So at the moment, I think you'd have to conclude we're not providing the kind of effective check, and we're not enforcing these norms of behavior to the kind of degree that we really need to.
So, Congresswoman, you mentioned earlier that unlike much of the country, you actually like many of your fellow members of Congress. Is there a personality, is there sort of a personal connection that you have that could somehow claw back Congress's role in this? What does it take to repair the kind of rift that both of you guys have referenced in terms of the way that Congress is functioning?
Well, you know, I mean, there are definitely relationships that I have with Republicans on particular issues. So if you look at the big issues like the environment, health care, investigating the president, yes, we are extremely polarized. But there are some issues that we come together on. And I'm fortunate that I work on issues that I work very closely and positively with my Republican colleagues. One is child welfare. The other one is the international issue of Africa. So, and I don't know if you heard the president's speech at the United Nations today. Most of it was embarrassing, but one thing that he did say that I thought was helpful, he talked about how we came together in a bipartisan, bicameral fashion and authorized $1 billion in assistance for famine relief because the world is on the brink of one of the worst humanitarian crises in the last, well, since 1945. And so the U.S. stepped up to the plate, and we did that in a bipartisan, bicameral fashion. So I think in this time period of madness, it's very important to identify certain issues that we can come together on and get things done. The thing that is challenging for both of us, though, is that you can't get any coverage of that. So the media doesn't really cover anything that we actually do together because that's not considered sexy. But I do want to respond to, in part, what my colleague was saying. There are some Republicans that have been willing to step up, but what we're finding out is they're retiring. I mean, Charlie Dent is a person who announced his retirement the other day. But I think what's really important, because you also asked a question about the institutions, it's important to recognize that when Trump set up his cabinet, he essentially picked secretaries to dismantle the agencies that they're in charge of, whether you're talking about education, the environment, health and human services, the Justice Department, the State Department, the Secretary of Energy. All of those cabinet secretaries were essentially put in place to dismantle the agencies or to go on search of anything Obama did so that we can erase his presidency from our history.
So that's sort of a sobering answer to this question here, that the institutions themselves
are in danger.
Congress as a bulwark against the administration, you're saying is not functioning properly. Congresswoman, what needs to change at the Congress level for that dynamic to change?
Well, I mean, I have to be honest with you, and I'm not sure how my colleague will answer it, but we need to change power. We need to take back the House of Representatives. And we need 24 seats in order to do that because, and our leader says this all the time, Nancy Pelosi says that she says to our Republican colleagues, would they please take their party back because they've allowed their party to be hijacked. And I think that's what needs to happen. They need to take their party back. We need 24 seats in the House because even if Trump is impeached, we would have President Pence, who to me represents the same ideology as Trump, and he would be far more effective at it. But
Congresswoman, is a changing of party going to change norms?
Well,
that we
I think a
talked about?
changing of part, but remember, I said two things. I said the Republicans take back their party, and the Democrats take control of the House. Now, one of the things that's happened to the Democratic Party is that we used to have a lot more moderate Democrats who were defeated, actually, when I came in. When I came in, we lost 65 seats. The Tea Party essentially seized control of the Republican Party. So I think the Republican Party needs to be more diverse, and some of my friends here in California wouldn't like for me to say this, but I do think that the Democratic Party, for us to regain power, we do have to be more politically diverse as well. We can't be so far to the left.
But my question is, will a change in power bring back the kind of behavior that we used to be accustomed to in terms of politics? Or do you think that essentially the cat is out of the bag and that's it?
Well, I mean, I can't believe that and fly across country twice a week. I do think that it can get better. Now, again, I'm a newbie. I've only been there 7 years, so I've only seen the madness. I believe my colleague has been there longer, and he saw Congress when Congress was functioning better. But, you know, I mean, these things, it's like a pendulum. It swings, and I do think that people have learned a lot about the extreme nature of this time period, and I do think that people would be a lot more moderate in the future. I wonder, given that you've been there longer, if you would feel, how you would feel about that.
You know, I think you're right. There was a real turning point in the time that I've been there when we had that Tea Party revolution, because it wasn't just that we had this big block of members who really their reason for being was not to govern, it was to tear down.
Right.
But you also had, and if they represent a third of the GOP conference, you also had a phenomenon develop where another third of the Republican conference lived in fear of having a Tea Party challenge in the future. So you had a third who were really unwilling to do something positive or constructive and were more than willing to let the country default on its debt. You had another third that lived in fear of being challenged and therefore would vote the same way often as the Tea Party. And then you had a third of the GOP that we would consider more mainstream, which was more like the GOP that was in the Congress, in the majority when I arrived there 17 years ago, that we could work with, that we could reach agreements on. It wasn't certainly bipartisan nirvana, but it was at least a very functioning body. Now that's changed. I also agree that in terms of the restoration of norms and the restoration of accountability, that will take having one house or the other in the hands of the party not in power in the White House. Because, you know, I think we have waited time after time as the administration has done one thing after another and waited for our colleagues to take back their party or find their voice, right, only to be disappointed that not even that was enough. And so I think the media have been a potent check and the courts have been a potent check, but not nearly a sufficient check. That will only come, I think, when you have frankly divided government again. In terms of the long-term prognosis and can we get back to a place where once again there are certain norms of behavior, I think we can. You know, I take heart in the fact that this is the same country that elected Donald Trump is the same country that elected Barack Obama. It's not like half the country left. We are the same country. And when I get discouraged about things, I also think back on something Bill Clinton once said. There's nothing wrong in America that can't be cured by what's right in America. And I think we've seen a lot of what's right in America in the last 6 months, and people taking the streets and expressing themselves and getting involved for the first time, and in governors' offices around the nation. I'm very proud of Jerry Brown. When the President of the United States walked out of the Global Climate Pact and essentially abdicated leadership on the global stage, our governor said, well, I'll be the leader on climate change. And the California legislature said, we'll be the leader on climate change. And we'll not only do what we would have done, we'll do more than we would have done. And so I think we can restore some of these norms of behavior, and we can restore accountability, both with a change of majority, but also when we have a different occupant of the Oval Office, which at you know, whatever point we will have. So I don't think that these are set in stone and and things that cannot be corrected with time.
Okay, but one thing that this president is very effective at is getting others to follow him down the path of a new norm, of breaking traditional patterns of behavior and making these new ones seem acceptable. So, for example, we see that the media has, in many ways, when we talk about the media, that's a big, broad category, and we do need to distinguish it, but there are certainly different forms of behavior. Here we have a comment about Fox taking down one of their Seth Rich stories without any explanation. Sorry?
Seth Rich.
Seth Rich stories. And then we also see members of the press who traditionally would have been assiduously nonpartisan in their public statements. Glenn Thrush, one of the White House reporters for the New York Times, making, sort of stepping off the objectivity box to say something a lot more pointed and argumentative. Not that it's necessarily factually inaccurate, but that's a different type of behavior than we've seen from the press in the past. So if we have the press behaving, and this is again a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if the president declares the press an enemy, they are going to react. Then he essentially can point out that they are behaving in a partisan way, and that's another norm that we have lost. So these things now seem like they're falling like dominoes. Is there, do you really believe that with a change in media and a change in representation in Congress, that is going to be enough, or is there something else that we're missing here?
Well, and you all can write this off as an aspect of my party affiliation, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of this comes down to the leadership at the very top. And the leadership at the very top is one that is belittling, demeaning, antagonistic towards the press. And I'm very proud, actually, of how our press has handled it, and the fact that they have not allowed themselves to be bullied, and they have stood up to him. It's certainly true that our press has to weigh, when they deal with the President of the United States, whether they're willing to confront him and whether that means they will lose access to the President. And it would be very easy for the press to turn on each other and try to exploit an opportunity to be close and therefore get the scoops and therefore sell more papers. They're not doing that.
Nobody's buying more newspapers. I got news.
Well, yes. I'm speaking metaphorically. They're not doing that, and I'm very proud of the fact that the press are willing to stand up and not be bullied. We do have, a very balkanized press, though, and you have media outlets that I think act very irresponsibly.
Right.
We also now have people, and this is a big and growing problem, who are living in their own information worlds. And it's not just Fox versus other stations, but because of the democratization of information on the net, you can now live in your own particular news niche, where you're surrounded by others who also believe there's a child sex predator ring operating under a pizza parlor. But even separate apart from that, I now feel like I'm a one-person focus group, because people recognize me more than they used to, and they tell me exactly what they think. I remember stepping off the platform at Penn Station and having one New Yorker come up to me and shake my hand and say, "Are you Adam Schiff? I just want to shake your hand. You're my hero." But I didn't have a chance to enjoy that, because the next New Yorker came up to me and said, "Well, you are not my hero. Why are you eavesdropping on our conversations and leaking them to the press?" And my first reaction was, holy cow, this is what New York members of Congress deal with every day. But my second reaction was, I know what this person is watching, and I know what that person is watching, and they're obviously not watching the same thing.
Right.
And they're living in two completely parallel universes. And you add to that problem the fact that now a lot of what you're getting exposed to is completely bogus information. And it's bogus information sent to your social media feed by mechanical process, by a bot that may not even be operating in this country. And we now have to be deeply skeptical of what we get in the news, because most of us, if you're below, well, I can't say us, most of you who are below a certain age get your news from your social media feed. And the way those platforms choose the information that you're going to read also can contribute to the balkanization of information and perspective. So there's a whole host of challenges now that weren't around when I was your age and in college. I remember rushing home to the dormitory, nerd that I was, to see Walter Cronkite's last broadcast. And the nice thing about that time was that at least there was a common set of facts that we agreed upon, even though people had widely divergent viewpoints. And we've lost a lot of that. And that goes well beyond the responsibility of any one person, including the president. But in a country that, for good reason, venerates the First Amendment, it's a really tough problem to even begin to think about how we deal with.
Congresswoman, as Speaker, you experienced a sort of previous iteration of this with Republican members of the Assembly being afraid to vote for anything that would create new revenue in California because of the treatment they would receive in conservative talk radio and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about operating in that environment? And also maybe fill us in on some of the details?
On what?
On some of the details of that period of 2008 to...
Sure. Well, in 2008, during the time that I served as Speaker, was when California was in a complete free fall. Just to give you an example, our state budget went from $110 billion to $83 billion, which meant as the legislature, we had to cut that much, which is why tuition went up and healthcare was cut and everything. So it was a very tough time. But, you know, and this is a partisan statement, but it's also just fact. Our parties function differently. And so within the Republican Party, every time a Republican wanted to think about voting for the budget, their lives were threatened. You had the John and Ken show on KFI that would behead you and put your head on a stick. And with sound effect and everything, for any Republican that thought about voting for the budget. And so as Speaker, I viewed myself as Speaker for the entire legislature. So at different points in time, I had to make sure that my Republican colleagues had protection because they were coming under threat. That type of thing doesn't happen. There's no Democratic equivalent of that. If I wanted to stand up and say that I don't support single payer, I'm not worried about anybody threatening my life. And then the other thing that would happen is that candidates, the Republican Party itself would run candidates against another Republican if they dared to say that they would raise taxes. And then we had our governor, our celebrity governor, so I felt I kind of had a taste of this before we all decided to have this in our country. And so what Arnold would do is he would go to the Republicans. See, Twitter wasn't that developed at the time. So instead of tweeting against a Republican, he would go to their district and have rallies. Now, he was actually supporting the Democratic side in the sense that he wanted them to vote for the budget. But those Republicans that voted for the budget are no longer elected officials. In the time that I was Speaker, the Republicans fired 3 Republican leaders because they voted for the budget. So the abusive nature of what happens in the Republican Party, it's just not equal in the Democratic side. That just doesn't happen.
Well, let me push back against that a moment, because I believe it was yesterday that Nancy Pelosi was shouted down by a bunch of protesters very upset with the fact that
I'm not saying we don't get criticized or shouted down, but I don't think anybody's talking about beheading her and threatening her life. And a radio show, let me give you another example. We got the Profiles in Courage Award. So we all went, the 4 legislative leaders went to the Kennedy Center, very prestigious award. We were very honored. The Kennedy Center had to have extra security because the John and Ken show flew to Boston and tried us in effigy. And it was mainly the Republicans, and my Republican colleagues at the time were running for office. They lost their election. There's not an equivalent there. That's not to say that we don't get shouted down. Of course we do sometimes, but there's no comparison.
So we've been talking a lot about a norm-breaking president, but we've also been talking about just the different ways in which the media functions. And you mentioned social media platforms, particularly Facebook, that can create this kind of atomized reality. That's not going to go away. However, you've also seen behavior from these platforms that can be highly suspect. It is completely unregulated. And we've seen whether or not you are taking ads out on Facebook against, to incite particular hate groups, or whether your Facebook pages have been infiltrated by foreign forces trying to suppress a vote or something like that. These are giant California companies that employ a lot of people. Do you think that they should face regulation in some way? Is there a way to regulate these companies and change this ecosystem that we're talking about?
Well, first of all, I think we're only beginning really to understand some of the challenges of facing not just these social media companies, but facing the whole country in terms of how we can be confident of the information that we're receiving. The companies themselves, just I can tell you in the context of the Russia investigation, they're still learning how the Russians took advantage of their platforms. And now there may be very legitimate criticism about why is it taking them so long to come to grips with what the Russians did on their own platform. I would be, I guess, wary to rush to a conclusion about what the federal government ought to do by way of regulation until we fully appreciate just how the social media platforms are being utilized for hostile purposes. Because frankly, there are a whole range of issues that we've got to grapple with. One of them I mentioned earlier, and that is that a very substantial part of the content of what we get in social media around elections now comes from automated sources. And it looks human, and it looks organic, and it's entirely misleading. And what do we do about that? I'm trying to understand even how the algorithms work that these social media companies are using, and how they can be manipulated by those who do not mean us well. What I found most significant about the Facebook disclosures, frankly, in the last couple of weeks, is not just the fact of advertising in an election by a foreign power, but what they were advertising. And what they were advertising was really designed to deepen the divisions within our society, to set one American against another. They created a fake webpage in Texas called Heart of Texas that sounded very indigenous, very don't mess with Texas. If you didn't notice that a lot of the syntax was bad, you wouldn't know that it was Russian at all. And the nefarious thing about it—
You're saying that Texans have good syntax?
I wasn't going that far, but they have different syntactical problems. But part of what makes this so nefarious is they can plant this cyber seed, and then it grows organically, and then they can withdraw, and it takes on a life of its own. And it becomes a hub for people and where they get their information. It's then compounded by the fact that if you show a predilection towards certain news and certain information, the algorithm will send you more like news. Now, to give you one example that I think is not the case, because I think Facebook dealt with this, that group that was circulating information about a child sex predator ring that Hillary Clinton was involved in under a pizza parlor. If you showed interest in something like that, news about that, the algorithm would send you news about other completely bogus, weird conspiracy theories. That particular problem may have been dealt with, but if you showed interest in what was going on in the Northwest with the kind of anti-government militia group, you might get more information, supportive information, slanted news along similar lines. What do we do about that? Well, it's very difficult with the First Amendment to regulate here. And the first principle has to be do no harm. I think we need to work cooperatively with the tech companies in terms of the intelligence community. When we discern that a foreign power is intervening, we need to let them know. They need to let us know so that we can take steps to deal with things that are not legally either permitted or that we have the power to regulate. So I certainly wouldn't exclude the possibility of regulation in this area, but I think we're just scratching the surface and understanding the problem. And until we really do understand it, I don't think we know what the right remedy is. At the end of the day, I come down to what our answer has always been. Not that I find great solace in it these days, but I think it may be the only answer, and that is that the antidote is more good information, not trying to constrict or censor other bad information.
So I find that answer, I have to be honest, a little unsatisfying for two reasons. The first is when you say that Facebook wasn't aware of how this was operating, and they're only now just becoming aware of that. That's by design, because Facebook has never assumed the responsibility for that kind of stuff because they've automated everything. The second point is the way in which you describe that information travels, and if you click on Pizzagate, you're going to get more conspiracy theory. That's also by design. So those are two big issues that I think are, that Facebook has been allowed to sort of run with without having any pushback from the legislature, from regulators, et cetera. So by simply saying, expecting them to police themselves, I don't find to be quite convincing, particularly from what we've seen so far.
I'm not suggesting we let them police themselves, and I'm not certainly excusing how long it took Facebook to come to grips with what the Russians were doing on their platform. I think it is certainly fair to ask the question, was economics the driving force behind not doing a more vigorous investigation internally earlier? What I am saying, though, is it's very difficult for us to regulate and tell Facebook or any other social media platform what their algorithm ought to be. I do think that we need to do oversight, and I think we do need to and have to expect, and to the degree we can, encourage and compel every corporate citizen to be a good corporate citizen. But if you can tell me what a regulation would even look like that tells Facebook what its algorithm should be, that's more than I feel comfortable doing. And that's why I say I think we need to learn a lot more about the problem before I'm ready to say, okay, here's the regulatory remedy.
Okay, Congresswoman, you've seen some of the stuff that's traveled on Facebook, and it probably doesn't hit your particular newsfeed, but you've certainly seen some of the impacts of it. How do you feel about these companies continuing to proceed as business as normal, or asking them to simply do a better job?
I don't think I have anything more to add than the congressman. I mean, to me, it's really learning an awful lot more about what has been going on. So for me, this information was new. The whole thing about how the Russians were feeding information through Facebook was something I had not been aware of.
Well, we've all seen the consequences of this media environment, right, in which we can operate in completely different spheres from our neighbor or something, you know, our coworker, et cetera, or your fellow member of Congress. In this environment, Congressman, as your committee prepares to produce a report about potential collusion of Russia with the Trump campaign in the 2016 election, how are people supposed to believe whatever the conclusions of that report are? And I have to be honest, because I don't want to sort of pull myself out of this group. If your report basically finds that there is no collusion or no dramatic interference or something like that, I might find that difficult to believe as a citizen, considering the media that I consume. And if you do find something that is scathing and a tremendous indictment of the administration, there's certainly a huge segment of the country that is going to find that difficult to believe. How do you deal with that as an institution, and how do you bring credibility to that work?
Well, I think it's a core challenge for us. In the first instance, we need to do a thorough investigation. And if it's at all humanly possible, we need to arrive at a single conclusion. Because, in my view, we will have added very little value as a committee doing an investigation if at the end of the day we produce two reports, a Democratic report and a Republican report, and we allow the country to choose which version they want to believe. Mm-hmm. So in the first instance, I think we do a thorough investigation, and if at all humanly possible, and Mr. Conaway and I are doing our very best, we want to arrive at a common conclusion, and not just a common conclusion with our committee, but ideally both House and Senate arriving at the same conclusion. Now, will the country accept what we find? I think in significant part that depends on how transparent we are about our investigation, which is a challenge because a lot of it deals with classified sources of information. Some of the investigation, a big chunk of it, has to be done in closed session. There are good investigatory reasons why you don't want one witness to profit from listening to another witness so that they can either tailor their stories or color the stories or converge their stories. But nonetheless, we ought to do as much of the investigation openly as we can so that it's not some opaque process where at the end of the day we throw open the doors and say, here's our report, you just have to believe it. But we still may confront the fact that we have a president who's unwilling to accept any fact that's adverse to him. And so it's entirely possible that were we to find and prove collusion between his campaign and the Russians, the president would simply call it a fake. And there may be a substantial number of people who accept that version, that alternate factual reality. All we can do, I think, is do our best to do a credible and thorough investigation. And of course, Bob Mueller is trying to do the same thing, and then be able to articulate how we reach the conclusions that we have. And I have to hope that at the time that that happens, we have members of both parties willing to stand up to the president if he disputes the conclusions that we reach.
Is there something, yes, and if there's anything beyond the audacity of hope that you can tell us about how we might react to this?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, to the extent that your committee has been able to move the investigation forward has really been a tribute to your leadership. And I'm not just saying that, because the other guy that was the chair, who is no longer acting in that role now, at least I think, Nunes, was very weak and was totally busted of being in collusion with the White House. You remember when he went over there to tell the White House what they already knew, and they told him, and he got exposed for that and then had to be removed? So we do have to recognize that this is a political environment. And I would like to think that my Republican colleagues could rise to the occasion of doing an objective investigation. This is just my opinion. I think until Trump's poll numbers go down in their districts and they don't feel threatened by his voters, that's what it's going to take for them to really be objective. The other thing that I think is really scary about the media is that you can turn on Fox, and Fox is doing a completely different story. I mean, you will have news reporters on Fox that say that the Russian investigation is a hoax.
Right. They're still on Benghazi.
Right. I mean, and so as long as you have people that are watching, in my opinion, news that is just not even accurate, are not even reporting the story at all, you know, at different points in time, we could be in major places at the investigation, and you turn on Fox and they're doing a human interest story. They just won't even, it's not that they'll give you a different spin, they just won't even show that story at all. And so that really concerns me. But where I hold out hope, though, is one, again, I do think Trump's poll numbers will eventually go down in a lot of the Republican districts, and they won't feel threatened by him. But there are other investigations going on. So there's the Mueller investigation that's completely independent of Congress. But then there's also organizations, good government organizations like CREW, that are really looking into the emoluments and the conflict of interest and all of that. So it's not, everything doesn't just rest on the House and the Senate committees.
So, Congressman, on that point about his poll numbers, what I think is so surprising is how resilient they have been in certain quarters. And that is also partly the fact that those people are the ones watching these sources of media that you and I don't consume, that operate in a different realm in terms of the information that they receive, and that's not going to change. So do you think that beyond just simply a drop in the poll numbers, is there anything else that would get Congress to change, or that would get more members of Congress to show more backbone on this issue?
No, I mean, I think the investigation, you know, maybe indictments or something coming from Mueller, but I don't agree. I do think that his poll numbers are eventually going to go down. And one thing that I say to everybody all the time is that I know we've all been traumatized by this president, because it feels like he's been in office like 3 years. He's only been in office about 250 days, and he has the lowest poll numbers of any president in history. And so I think that there is hope. The other thing that I always say, and that this might sound a little strange, Trump did do one thing he said he was going to do. He said he was going to bring us all together, and he did do that. He brought us all together in opposition. And so people are now working across issue and working on areas that they had never thought about. Like, you look at Charlottesville, you look at Boston, you had massive anti-racist protests. And the overwhelming majority of people that were protesting was white. And to me, that was so exciting because it showed that people are taking up the mantle on issues that they never would have done that before. When the Muslim ban happened, you went to the airport, there were thousands of people who never thought about immigrant rights before protesting. And so to me, all of that is hope. All of that works together. So his own problems, the investigations, the resistance and opposition, all of that is going to play a factor in driving his poll numbers down.
Okay. I do want to open it up for questions in just a moment, but before we do that, I want to say, now we've talked about the role of the media and changing norms there and the mood in Congress and in the White House. What is the role of the public in this beyond just calling members of Congress and protesting? Is there some type of civic behavior that you think the public needs to adopt, considering the environment that we're living in now?
Well, you know, I've been, frankly, very encouraged for the same reason that my colleague was mentioning, that so many people are becoming active for the first time. And the other thing that has been so apparent to me is just how viscerally people feel about the election and what is happening to the country, how it's affecting how they eat and how they sleep and even relationships with other people. My wife and I went on vacation with my in-laws, and she was about to ask how they voted, and I said, please don't ask, I don't want to know. It's affected us very deeply, and I think for many people, just the blizzard of bad things that are happening is paralyzing. And what I encourage people to do, frankly, is not try to take on all of this at one time, but to identify one or two things they care the most about and decide, I'm going to make a difference on that. I'm going to make a difference on the environment, or I'm going to make a difference on protecting voting rights. There's a role for everyone to play right now, and there are lots of good opportunities and ways to do it. Some are really interesting and innovative, but I think it's that activism that's going to get us through this. And so what ultimately gives me hope for the future is just seeing how many people are engaged, and we need folks to stay that way.
Congressman, is there another play in the civic action playbook that we should
Yes,
adopt?
I mean, I've been excited by this time period, but I will tell you, though, that I joke and say I have a new job, that I've become a political therapist, because people need therapy, let me tell you. And in a couple of years, when the therapists add up, you know, what they've been treating people for, I mean, I'm serious. Anecdotally, you will hear this from psychologists and psychiatrists, what they're talking to people about now. It's not their marriages, it's about Trump. And so I've been holding town halls, and I stopped holding them in an official manner, and I hold them in a political manner. And I say that because there's lines. I can't talk politics. I can't say I want to take back the House and defeat Republicans in an official town hall. And so what I did right after the election, we'd have these town halls, and I'd usually get a couple hundred people. Now I was getting 400, 500, 600 folks coming, and everybody was just losing their mind. Because a lot of people are frankly frightened that this guy is going to run across the hall, get that football, and hit a button and blow up the world. I mean, people really are literally afraid. And so what I said to folks is that, okay, just like my colleague said, you want to know what to do, then we need to get active. So what we've been doing is we've been putting people on buses, we've been going to Republican districts, we've been doing voter registration, voter education, you know, and actually getting people involved. And I think that that is critical. So we need to take the opportunity that he is giving us now, because I view all of his madness as gifts. He's giving us so many things to work on, so many ways to work on them, and we need to change our culture. You talk about changing a norm, let me tell you a norm that needs to change. When you elect people, we just expect them to go away and then just, you know, do everything. We can't function without the outside support and pressure. DACA is a perfect example. A few years ago, even Democrats weren't sure of what they thought about DACA. These young folks organized, they came to the Capitol day after day in their caps and their gowns, they talked about their stories, and they've changed the norm. Now you don't have an issue within Democrats about how they're gonna vote on DACA, and you have Republicans scrambling. And so we have to change the norm that civic engagement means you go to vote. No, voting is one thing, but you have to stay engaged, and you have to stay engaged with elected officials Sometimes, you know, the pressure, like you said, Pelosi went through the other day, sometimes it's not pretty. But the point is that you have to have the outside pressure in order to make the inside work.
You want to try to follow that, Congressman?
Well, only to fully agree. What I was thinking, as my colleague was making this point, we've gotten into the habit, I think, of imagining that if we just elect the right president, it's going to solve all our problems. And the world just isn't like that. There is no single person that we can elect to deal with all of this. And what's more, things have become so difficult structurally within the Congress that they're given very little rein to do things. So we can't wait under the expectation that if we just have the right person, it's going to make all this better. We all have to take responsibility for making things happen in a very positive way. And I get back to something Barack Obama used to say, which is so consistent with what Karen just said, and that is, you know, we are the change we've been waiting for. And that is, this isn't on someone else to do. This is on us to do. And we have the control of our own destiny here. But I also think right now that this is a time when every one of us is going to be held to account. What did you do during this national nightmare? And so I think Karen's absolutely right.
Doesn't it seem like it was so long ago that Obama was president? You remember those days?
Well, that's part of the changing of norms and how easily we accept new normative behavior. I'd like to recognize my colleague, David Craig, over here, who I co-teach a class with, and the students are here in attendance too, so. Yes.
All right, I just wanted to ask
You want mine?
about media education regulation. Promoting media literacy in the classroom. After the fall of the Soviet Union, a number of Eastern European countries instituted media literacy. A number of Eastern European countries, after the fall of the Soviet Union, instituted media literacy in K through 12 as a way to understand the transition from a state-based propaganda media system to a commercial media system. We still continue to valorize STEM education, but it does seem to me that media literacy and education, particularly promoting good news production on social media platforms, is more vital than ever to a healthy democracy. What can you in the Congress do to help set that agenda around media literacy and education?
You've stumped them.
You know, I think that's an excellent point. And if there was ever a time, I think, where we needed far more media literacy, it's now. Both in terms of the balkanization of media, but also in terms of the fact that we are now going to have to develop a much healthier skepticism about what we read, particularly online. So I think that's a really important point. One thing I have marveled at that's implicit in your question is why the Russians are so credulous about what they read. The Russians used to read Pravda and Izvestia, and they knew it was a load of bull, and they were deeply skeptical. But now they seem to believe whatever RT or Sputnik or whatever feeds them. And it's extraordinary, and it makes me wonder what has changed about the Russian character. It probably has more to do with the Russian government now and the charismatic figure of Putin. But I do think that we're going to have to embark on a whole new level of educating ourselves about the changing nature of where we get our information and how to be skeptical and how to be good citizens in terms of what information we share, and as well as how we conduct ourselves on social media.
So I don't think Congress has the answer for everything, you know what I mean? So I'm not sure that there's something specifically that we can do, but I'll tell you what we could do is we could stop cutting education. We could figure out how these young people here are gonna pay USC's tuition. We could do that, you know, and make college more affordable. I think those are the things that we can do.
Let's please see hands in the audience if you'd like to ask a question to our guests here, and we can run a mic over there. Go right ahead. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Please, if you want to.
Oh, no, I'm saying I have the mic.
You want to pass that over to somebody, unless you want to sing?
Okay, I have a question in particular about both of your guys' support for Medicare for All, or as people are calling it, Bernie Care. So if the state of California was unable to pass what it was effectively single payer because it was twice the budget, and the last tabulation of Bernie's original Medicare for All plan from the campaign cost, what was it, $1.4 trillion? How is that feasible? How would Medicare for All in the United States be funded without increasing taxes to 50% or by treating capital gains as income?
Well, I'm happy to take a stab at it. I don't think anyone is under the expectation that this is something that's going to be accomplished overnight. Right. I do think that there are ways to get there and do so in a responsible way. I've been in the Congress long enough to have been there when we passed the ACA, and one of the things that we tried to do was pass a public option as a part of the ACA so you could buy into a Medicare-like program. Had we been able to do that and given people the experience of buying into a single-payer system, it would have given the country experience with it, it would have given people experience with it, and it would have been a model that could be expanded. I still think we can do that. I like the idea, frankly, of being able to tell people at this point in time that if you can't afford to buy in the private market, you can buy into Medicare. And I think that is a good bridge to a Medicare for all system. I think at the end of the day, if you look at what we spend on premiums and what we spend on taxes to support the current healthcare system, we could probably spend less on a more efficient system like a Medicare system. So that's where the revenue comes from. It's not as if we're not paying for it now. We're just paying for it in a pretty inefficient way. But I think what we ought to be looking at is not what the Republicans are going to try to do over the next 2 weeks, which is cut 20 million people off their health care, but rather how do we expand and put tens of millions of people in a position where they can get health care. And I think using the Medicare model is a good way to do that.
Congresswoman, healthcare is very much in your lane.
Yes, many years ago in a previous life, I worked in healthcare. I actually was on the faculty at the medical school here over on Zonal Avenue for years. And I happen to believe that this is the richest country in the history of the world, and it's inexcusable for us not to provide healthcare to everyone. And that fundamentally, if you have healthcare that is driven by profits, it just doesn't work, and that's one of the biggest drivers. So I think it's really important to aspire for, support Medicare for all, single payer, all of that. But I do think, like most things, if you're going to fundamentally change a part of your society, it's going to take a broad social movement to make that happen. And so I'm encouraged by all of the activism. I know that it's not going to happen right now, but that doesn't mean that you don't continue to fight for it, aspire for it, and do everything we can. Frankly, today, right now, I'm worried about them getting that last vote over in the Senate to destroy the Affordable Care Act. But I really think it's important that we continue to fight that a fundamental principle, healthcare should be like K through 12 education. You don't think about that. You know that that's free. If you want to go to private school, you can go to private school, but you don't question that you don't have access to school. And that's the way we need to think about healthcare in our country.
Okay. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question here, and one of the folks with the mic will make their way to you. So there we go.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, is this working? Hi. My name's Jonathan Chrisman. I'm a PhD student in the urban planning program and a proud constituent of Representative Bass. My question has to do with, I guess, the role of the media traditionally conceived of as a place to provide information. And with the issue of climate change, for example, among many other issues, just the provision of information has been demonstrated to sort of freeze people in their tracks, to sort of scare people from action because it seems like too big of an issue to deal with. And instead, providing possible solutions is one way of kind of breaking through that. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about that phenomenon, and particularly the role of the media in not just providing information, but going beyond that. Where is the line between the role of the media as just an information provider and sort of possibility producer or suggester?
So again, traditionally the media has tried to sort of referee these two positions, even if these two positions aren't equal, right? So that it seems as if there's a debate on climate change because there is somewhere a dissenting opinion. Can you talk a little bit about how you've experienced this issue and maybe what you've had to deal with as a consequence?
And as we sit here now, a hurricane, Category 5, is approaching Puerto Rico. But that has nothing to do with climate change. It just, happens that we have all of these dramatic climate events. I think it's just, one, I think documentaries play a really important role in that we do have stations, some of the news stations that will, have documentaries. But I think it's important. If you're going to report the news and it's the truth, how do you not raise the issue of climate? Especially when you're in the midst of horrific climate-related events while you're covering the news. In these past hurricanes, there was very little talk of climate change.
Except on Rush Limbaugh's show, who declared it a hoax. But Congresswoman, as we've already discussed earlier here, is it a question really of supply of good quality information? Because I do believe that there is a tremendous supply of good quality of information. I think it's more about the delivery and the consumption of that quality of information, which, as we discussed earlier, when it comes over social platforms, the entire incentive of those platforms is to serve you more of what you like. Therefore, if you do not like the notion of climate change, you are not going to encounter that. Which brings me back to, I think, the broader question here is how do we function if these companies continue to operate along these lines with no checks? Is there some, I know that you both seem very hesitant to engage in any sort of talk about regulation, but is there any other check that we can have on the operation of information that comes over social media?
Well, first of all, I guess I would say that in terms of the specific point that you were making about the overwhelming nature of the threat posed by climate change and it being paralyzing, there's not much that we can do about that as a government. I do think it's the role of journalists to tell it like it is and not to simply say, well, the one side says the climate is changing, the other side says it isn't, and who knows. This is an established fact, and I think the press ought to treat it as an established fact, even if they do write stories about deniers. What I'm concerned about is the fact that back in the Bush administration, they hired a Columbia journalism student to basically excise any references to climate change that were coming out of federal agencies and that were coming out of NASA. And now we have the same thing happening again, where people are scrutinizing people who are working on earth sciences and people who did papers on climate change and whatnot in an effort to censor or demote or whatever people who in the government or at academic institutions who receive government funding from doing that work because it runs contrary to the narrative they want to tell. We do have a responsibility to make sure that we put a stop to that. I don't think that this is necessarily, I see a connection here to the issues with social media. I don't think social media has affirmatively tried to push out a climate denier line. Now, what should the social media companies do when deniers use their platform? Is it the job of the social media companies to basically say, this is true and this is false? I don't know that we can ask them to do that. I do think we need to ask them to make sure that they identify when there are fake people putting out information or foreign outfits that are putting out information. And they do need to grapple with that problem that the way their algorithms may be operating is not in society's best interest, and how do they change that? But I think
So how can you guys help that conversation forward about how they change that or accept some responsibility for the type of consequences that emerge from that?
I think it begins with oversight. And right now I've been proposing to my majority counterparts that we bring the social media companies in to testify in open before Congress so we can find out how rigorous was their analysis of what the Russians were doing on their platform. What can they tell us about it? When did they begin this analysis? And not just Facebook, which has been public now about at least one aspect of Russian involvement, but Twitter and Google and any other platform that the Russians may have used. But I think other committees also that aren't focused on Russia, because Russia is just one subset of the problem, ought to have the social media companies come in to testify about the societal impacts of how their platforms work and what it is doing to the kind of information people get and what are the issues that are raised and how much of this is within their capacity to do and what's the role of Congress in this. So I think it begins with oversight that has not yet adequately happened, and then that oversight ought to lead us to figure out, okay, what are the right regulatory or legislative remedies, and what are the steps that the companies need to take on their own.
Did you want to add something to that, Congressman?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of funny you said we were reluctant to talk about regulations. I don't know too many times when Democrats have been accused of being reluctant to talk about regulations. A better word I would use would be protections. But I think, though, that some of this stuff is still really new. So I could say I want it regulated, but if I don't have the specifics, it's not a reluctance. It's that we need to know more. So let me give you an example. Sex trafficking and the internet. And that's an issue that I've been working on, especially with underage girls. And, you know, there are a lot of social media platforms where they know that they are advertising girls, underage girls. And so Congress has been doing a lot of oversight and now is looking at legislation to hold the companies accountable. So I don't necessarily think there's a reluctance, but we do need to know what we're doing too.
Well, I think we also have to acknowledge that these companies have tremendous amounts of power, lobbying power in the classical sense for how much they spend, but also the way that they can mobilize public opinion, as they have in the past for legislation that has interested them.
Right, and you know, there's not too many major multinational corporations that don't have lobbyists. I do think, though,
but there are only a couple that have massive social networks at their disposal.
Yeah, that's true. And you know, when where that came up was the SOPA.
Yes.
Which was very interesting.
That acronym?
What'd you say?
Can you translate?
I can't, because I don't remember what it stands for. What does it stand for?
Online Piracy Act.
Yeah,
if I remember correctly.
And it was a war between the film industry and the tech community. And when the tech community got wind that the film industry was trying to move regulation, they mobilized big time. But let me tell you where I hope it gets mobilized is around net neutrality. Because that's a whole issue that we need to make sure that people are mobilizing about.
So
it hasn't been that strong.
I want to make sure that we get some other questions from the audience. And again, please raise your hand. I also want to recognize the person who runs the CCLP, Jeffrey Cowan, who's joined us. And Jeff, thank you so much for sponsoring this event. Would you like to say anything here? You're going to...
Thank you.
and I would say that you've got that half right.
All right, guys, cut it out.
With Karen.
Please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jeremy. We've been studying in our class How Not to Get Fooled in Journalism about the post-factual error. And it brought me to look up what the root word was for fact, which was made. And at the same time, I was looking at this idea of creating facts, as well as looking at the Pew Research study, which says that as media becomes more polarized, distrust in the media grows. And that is something that they've seen internationally as a common trend. So I was wondering how we combat this idea of there being multiple truths, while at the same time changing this trend, which causes people to distrust media outlets. The more combative we are and the more that we protest that this is false and this is true.
Okay, so you can either answer that now or in a five-page paper that David and I will correct. But let me just try to sort of give another version of that question. You guys represent pretty bedrock blue districts.
Yeah.
And your district has about as much in common with a district that went, 70% for Trump as, we do with a walrus here. I mean, it's completely different. Those people experience things in a different way and have a different reality, a different truth. And they have a different media. How do you relate?
Well, I think that's true in some areas, and in other areas it isn't. And let me give you a very specific example. The drug crisis that solid red Trump districts are experiencing. The opioid crisis. Well, you go down the street here, and there's a drug crisis too. And so to me, part of what we have to do as legislators is look for common points of unity. Where are our common areas so that it's not just drastically one side or another? And I could think of several issues: the unemployment, the loss of manufacturing. Hey, what happened over here? So to me, I think it's important that we proactively look for those issues where we have points in common.
Please go ahead. I think your mic is on.
Yeah, so my question is about Trump's criticism of the media, and I think we can all agree that the tone of the criticism has not been very, it's not been very nice. But do you guys think that there is merit in the content of the criticism? Do you guys think that, well, left-leaning media, especially like the New York Times or CNN, who've been specifically targeted by Trump, do you guys think that there's things in their coverage of the administration that can be improved to perhaps make their coverage more palatable, or to make it less biased somehow?
So I just want to note that you identified CNN and New York Times as left-wing media, which maybe a few years ago people wouldn't have had that label for it. But I think that the way that things have shifted, it certainly now is associated with that, rightly or wrongly. Do you have any response to what the quote-unquote mainstream media should do to make itself more palatable?
Well, I don't think it's the job of the mainstream media to try to make itself more palatable, or to, frankly, cower under criticism from the President of the United States. I think frankly, the mainstream media needs to continue doing what it's doing, which is reporting the facts. And where they're critical of the President, they need to be reported. And indeed, you know, it's the press's job to bring transparency to our government, and that is often going to be critical. I don't always like the coverage of myself, but I respect it. And I'm sure that Barack Obama didn't like the coverage he got on Fox, but he wasn't constantly out there attacking and demeaning Fox. So I don't think the mainstream media ought to respond to, frankly, this bullying by coloring its coverage of him. And I think instead, all the rest of us, Democrats and Republicans, need to underscore how much we value and treasure and need a free press. And that what the President is saying when he attacks the failing New York Times, which happily has its highest subscription ever, or any other, frankly, news platform that doesn't uniformly paint him in positive terms, that we, you know, call out these attacks on one of the institutions that's integral to our democracy. But you know, I think both these last two questions are highly interrelated, and we are in a situation where people have less and less confidence in the press. I think what the President is doing has really torn down confidence in the press. So it has been enormously destructive. It's going to be hard to build that back up. People now largely select the media that reinforces the view they had before they turned it on. Now that trend was already in the works before this president, but it is being aggravated and accelerated, both by his presidency and by the even greater democratization of information online. These are really hard problems, and they're very hard problems for the government to deal with, because we can't be in the business of deciding which news outlet is telling the truth and which isn't. But we should be in the business of underscoring that having a free media is integral to our democracy, and none of us ought to be attacking the free media, let alone the President of the United States.
So we've got time for about 2 more questions, and I have to say I'm shocked that nobody has asked anything about Russia, since we have Adam Schiff here.
You didn't have to encourage that.
Please raise your hand, and we'll get a mic to you. Somewhere over there, okay. And our other mic is circulating where? I'm not sure. Here we go. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Thomas. I'm an undergraduate student here at USC. I'm not an Annenberg student, but I'm taking a class with Professor Khan. I had a question. Earlier you mentioned that that when the Tea Party faction rose, that a lot of Republicans were fearful to act on their judgment instead of relying on party politics. Do you think that instead of having closed primaries, of having open primaries, so that any member of whatever party or independents could vote for who they wanted in their general elections. Do you think that would help and close the divide? Thanks.
We've got some experience with that in California, so please.
Yes, which happened on my watch. You know, to me, it's one thing to have an open primary, and it's another thing to have what we have here, which is the top two. You know, so whichever party, just the top two vote getters proceed to the general election. I don't like that system. I think it's been a windfall, though, for political consultants and fundraisers, because basically the notion when that went into effect, it was a reform that the governor wanted, was supposed to moderate our state legislature. Well, you could just look at what our state legislature did, which I think is great, but it's clearly didn't moderate anything. But what you have, like in my district, for example, and also in Adam's district, we both have elections in June. More than likely, we will have to face a Democratic opponent in November. So our consultants and our fundraisers will get paid twice, because we'll have to then have an election in November. So it didn't do what it was originally supposed to do. But the open primary just means you can vote across, you know, across lines. I don't have a problem with that, but my concern would be what we actually have here.
And I would just, and I agree completely. You not only have a race in June and November, but it's often a race against the same person.
Right.
You have a dry run in the June, and then you have the same race all over again in November. But I will say, I think that if you were going to point to a single process fix, and I would put an open primary in the category of process fix, the single most important is redistricting reform.
Yes.
Because
That's right.
the GOP locked in essentially a majority for 10 years, barring massive wave elections. And so the Congress isn't responsive to what people want, because the Congress is in most elections not in play. Now it is in play this time because of, I think, how poorly the other side is doing, but we shouldn't lock in a majority for either party. And I would think the single most important thing Democrats ought to do when Democrats take over the majority and have a Democratic president, on day one, we ought to pass a national redistricting reform that requires every state to do what California did. That, to me, is the single most important process reform. The other reform is more difficult because other process reform is more difficult. That is campaign finance reform, because I think it would require an amendment to the Constitution at this point. But the power has largely left the parties and left the building. So the Speaker might decide, like John Boehner, that immigration reform makes sense for the country, and might urge Republican colleagues to support a comprehensive immigration bill, but then those Republican colleagues leave the building, and outside groups say, if you support that amnesty, we are going to spend $5 million funding a primary opponent against you. And that member is likely to go back to the Capitol and say, Mr. Speaker, I really appreciate your advice, but don't let the door hit you in the backside on the way out. So I do think that we need to be able to reinstate limits, not only in contributions, which we have, but the limits, the post-Watergate reform that was struck down in Buckley versus Vallejo and made worse in Citizens United, that would allow us to put limits again on what are so-called independent expenditures, but aren't the least bit independent.
And what he just described does not happen on the Democratic side. It's important. It's not that the parties are exactly the same, because if you voted some way, nobody's going to run out and fund a campaign against you.
So we've got time for one more question here. Susan, if you want to grab a mic from someone. Can we get a mic to Susan? Thanks so much. Hold on.
Can't hear you.
We're going to amplify you. Here we go.
I thought I could swing it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Seeger. I teach First Amendment law here. This is directed to Congressman Schiff. When are you going to subpoena Facebook and hold public hearings about what did it know and about the Russian interference with the election by using Facebook?
Well, I've made the request to the majority that we have an open hearing with Facebook and Twitter and the other social media companies, so that we have a very open discussion of what the Russians did and what they know and how rigorous their analysis was and what else we might find if we dig deeper. I don't have the subpoena power myself.
Right.
And I would hope it won't be necessary even to use a subpoena. But before those companies come in and testify, they have to be asked. And I'm not in a position to ask them unilaterally, but I'm hoping that I can get the agreement of my counterpart, because I think that that hearing would be both a very important part of our investigation, our oversight, as well as informing the public of what the Russians did through the use of social media.
We're
And
on
your
Facebook.
sorry.
I was going to say we're on Facebook Live right now, so if you'd like to tell Mark Zuckerberg that you'd like to invite him before Congress, please.
Was there any interest by your colleagues in doing this, or is it too preliminary?
You know, I think there is interest, but we haven't reached agreement yet. We haven't cemented the deal yet. I think, frankly, it's going to happen. It'll either happen in our committee, or we will, if we wait too long, it'll happen in one of the Senate committees. That's a healthy competition, but I think that there is a growing recognition that, particularly in the light of what Facebook has now disclosed, but also some very good open source reporting, we really need to have them come in and testify, and it ought to be done in open session.
And I just hope that people really walk away from here and understand what it means when we do not have power as Democrats. So people all the time want to know, why don't we do this and why don't we do that? And understand that until we win those 24 seats and take back the House of Representatives, he can't do the investigation the way he would do it if he were the chair. So it's my hope that next November, Adam Schiff will be the chair of the Intel Committee and not the...
And we can subpoena Mark Zuckerberg. Okay, I want to thank our panelists for coming, for taking time out of their day to be with us, and thank you also for attending and for thoughtful questions. One public service announcement, my ASCJ 200 class, we're going to meet back in the room now. But again, let's thank our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much.